joining us today for our second installment of the Phillies Nation Book Club here at Holy Family University. Tonight we're going to be talking about Crash, the life and times of Dick Allen. It's appropriate as the Hall of Fame ballot was just announced a couple weeks ago. Obviously after an exciting Eagle season, we're ready to move into baseball starting Wednesday with pitchers and catchers. So we figured it was a good time to talk about a baseball story. Everyone likes home runs. Dick Allen's certainly an interesting guy and could hit home runs. So I think we're going to understand the life of Dick Allen as a person in addition to a baseball player, and I think that's a big part of the story here today. I want to introduce quickly our panelists. On the far left, returning with us is Mitchell Nathanson, professor of sports law in the Jeffrey S. Morad Center for the Study of Sports Law at Villanova Law School. He's written several books on baseball, including one on Dick Allen titled God Almighty Himself, The Life and Legacy of Dick Allen, released just in 2016. The book presents Dick Allen's life against the backdrop of organized baseball's continuing desegregation process and draws out some of the larger generational business shifts in the games, and Mitch is going to provide some of that context here today. We also have Frank Fitzpatrick, who's been an editor and writer at the Philadelphia Inquirer since 1980, a one-time beat writer for the Phillies, Eagles, and Penn State football. He's also covered 9 Olympics. 2000 Pulitzer Prize finalist. He now focuses on sports projects for the Inquirer and Daily News and writes the Sunday's column, as you may have seen, called Frank's Place. Dick had his fair share of run-ins with the sports media. Hopefully Frank can provide some perspective on that relationship. And then quickly myself, I am the sports marketing and management coordinator here at Holy Family, also founder of Phillies Nation, who's sponsoring tonight's event. So let's get into the discussion on Dick Allen, right? Don't call me Richie, Rich, Dick Allen, or as he preferred back at home, Sleepy, right? So if you don't know, Dick Allen was voted Rookie of the Year in 1964, the Phillies' infamous pennant losing season. He was the American League Most Valuable Player in 1972. He played on 7 All-Star teams, hit 351 home runs, and finished with a career batting average of .292. We'll talk plenty about baseball with Dick's numbers. Also, as you saw some of the posters in the back, there's plenty more to read about him. But we'll also talk about a few other topics, not just baseball related. Racism here in Philadelphia, in Little Rock, when Dick Allen started his career, and in baseball in general at the time. We'll talk about the relationship with the media, his roots from here in Pennsylvania, albeit on the other side of the state. And then also we'll kind of get into some of the specifics of the book. It is, after all, an autobiography, so certainly slanted from one perspective. So let's kind of begin with a little bit of context. As I mentioned, Mitch, your book on Dick Allen focuses on some of the surrounding issues during Dick's time in baseball. You know, it wasn't too far removed from Bill Veeck's failed experiment to buy the Philadelphia Phillies and load them with Negro League All-Stars. But at the time when Dick Allen came to the Phillies, he had some problems. Fans, the media, to say the least. What's some of the context there? How far had baseball come since Bill Veeck's idea, since Jackie Robinson? What's baseball like around that scene?
Well, I think that baseball, when you say baseball, it's hard to know who you're talking about, but let's say the people in Major League Baseball, because it's not all of baseball, but Major League Baseball, who denied that there was even a racial line for decades, right? Finally had to admit to it by the late 1930s, and then finally integrated in 47, reluctantly and very slowly. And I think the idea was for the people who were running Major League Baseball clubs that Well, once they integrated, it was over. It wasn't an issue anymore. And of course it was an issue. And so I think when you look at it, I think from baseball, Major League Baseball's perspective, the issue was over with. But I think from a lot of other people's perspective, it was really just beginning, in that what developed in the aftermath of Robinson was basically a two-tiered system where white players could pretty much say whatever they wanted, particularly if they were good players. Now, if you were not such a good player, you had to be a little more in line. But black players, even if they were superstars like Ernie Banks or Willie Mays, I mean, you really didn't hear those guys say a lot. And that was the expectation of no matter what. And so Alan comes along and he doesn't really want to play that game. And he doesn't, it was an interesting thing that I learned going through the book that I did, was that there were a lot of players from that first generation, black players, who were pulling him aside saying, this is how it is, this is how you gotta be, whatever. And his response was, no, I'm not gonna do that. You know, my role model isn't so much Jackie Robinson and Willie Mays as it is Mickey Mantle and Ted Williams. I want to be treated like they're treated, right? They get special treatment. You know, Mickey Mantle, the press covered up for Mickey Mantle. Ted Williams had his problems with the media, but still, you know, there was a little bit of deference there. And so that's what he wanted. And I think that clashed with the expectations of the time, which were that black players were going to come up, be thankful that they were there, and keep their mouth shut. And so that's the importance of Dick Allen, was that he was the first superstar, really, who forced Major League Baseball to deal with him on his terms.
And then specifically with the fans, you know, both in Little Rock and here in Philadelphia, he was plagued by bigoted fans as well. You know, we hear a lot about Philadelphia fans. Obviously, the Eagles' festivities notwithstanding, things seem to go okay. But he wrote in the book, at first they threw pennies at me, then big bolts, and finally beer bottles. And I began to wear a batting helmet in the outfield for protection. Right? And for the rest of his career, he wore a batting helmet for protection. You know, Frank, how does the fan base here in Philadelphia compare to other fan bases? Could Dick have done better if he was on a different team when he first started?
Well, you know, in talking about the integration of baseball, a lot of teams integrated more easily and successfully than the Phillies did. The Phillies were, excuse me, were the last National League team to integrate. And when they finally did integrate, it tended to be with Latin players, with, you know, Cubans and Panamanians. It wasn't until I think it was West Covington in 1961 that they actually got an African American ball player. So there was that backdrop of the team's attitude. Obviously, we're not one of the more progressive teams in baseball when it came to racial attitudes. And then there was the whole attitude of Philadelphia's, you know, racial atmosphere. You got to remember, this was the 1960s, and in the summer of 1964, the season that was Dick Allen's rookie year, North Philadelphia erupted in you know, some would call it a riot, some would call it, you know, legitimate protest, whatever, however you want to characterize it. It was a hot summer in North Philadelphia in 1964, which coincided with Dick Allen's first year. So racial attitudes in the city were inflamed, and I think Dick walked into that, you know, innocently enough, being a rookie. And the following season, when he had that infamous fight with a white player, Frank Thomas, and he was unable to tell his story, the racial divide really became clear. In the stands at Calumet Stadium, there were still those who cheered Dick, but there were a lot more who booed him and thought he was the culprit in that incident. So it was like Dick himself, it's a complex narrative, you know, his relationship with the fans here.
Can I say one thing that makes it, that I think adds to that, is Bob Carpenter, which I think one thing reading this book is, I find interesting, is that Allen had really nothing but nice things to say about Carpenter, when I think Carpenter was largely a huge reason why things were so tough for him. Because, you know, there are racists and jerks everywhere. But the reason that what happened in Philadelphia didn't happen in Brooklyn was because Branch Rickey made it very clear very early that they weren't going to put up with it. And so there was just as many racists and jerks in Brooklyn. but they weren't. They learned very quickly that if they tried to pull any of that at Ebbets Field, there was going to be repercussions. In Philadelphia, there was implied or even express acknowledgement that that was okay, and so that just gives you more and more. It gives those people more and more freedom and safety to say and do what they want. So it grew and grew and grew. And you know, if they had, I really think that if Carpenter was a stronger leader, and he's, you know, now you get to look into the heart and mind of Bob Carpenter, but you know, if they had somebody who was like Ricky, it may have been a little bit different. Wouldn't have been perfect, but I mean, what do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I agree. Carpenter family does not have certainly the Bob Carpenter era does not have a sterling record when it comes to race. I mean, it was the reason they didn't integrate until 1957 or whatever it was. So yeah, I would agree with that.
Right, there were a lot of lean Phillies years in the early 20th century. I'm sure he was just happy to have people in the seats. You know, the baseball as a whole, we talked about fans. What about sports writers? Frank, you know, a big part of why people think Dick Allen's not yet in the Hall of Fame was his contentious relationships with the local sports writers. What's that relationship like for a typical player? What's it like for someone like Dick Allen? You know, what are some examples in your career that you've had special relationships with a player?
Well, the one that always comes to mind in my case is, in terms of positive experiences, that was with Lenny Dykstra, who was, you know, not only the best player on those '93 Phillies that got to the World Series, but was also, from my perspective, by far the most intriguing player to write about on that team. I mean, he was like a man-child. He was half crazy and half brilliant, and you know, there was so many sides to him that it was like catnip to me. And but Lenny, unlike a lot of guys in the major leagues, was very media savvy. He knew every reporter, what paper they were from. The bigger the paper, the better he was going to relate to you. And since I was from the Inquirer, which was the biggest paper covering him on a regular basis, the big dog, he used to call it, he got, you know, he was fine with me. I could get what I needed out of Lenny, and it was a delicate dance I had to make, because I didn't want the fact that I knew he was playing up to me because he knew he could get something out of it, which was publicity and, you know, maybe a vote in the most valuable player ballot or something. I had to walk that line and make sure I wasn't crossing it, but he gave you so much. I mean, in fact, just a quick example, I wrote a story about him just this spring, about, and it was kind of a critical story. I mean, it was about how this guy has sort of lost his way, and he's manic, and still boorish and rude, and in many ways he's never grown up, and he's in his 50s now. And so when it was posted on Twitter and Facebook, I got ripped by the Lenny Dykstra supporters out there, and believe it or not, there are many. And Lenny jumped in and came to my defense, said, look, you know, this is the job he's got to do. He's not a cheerleader for me. He's supposed to tell an honest account of me, and I'm not perfect, and I realize it, and that's the story Frank's presenting, which I thought was the kind of the attitude you'd like every Major League ball player to have, but very few, believe me, do have that.
Yeah, I think they mentioned towards the end of the book, Bob Gibson was interviewed and pretty much just said that Dick Allen wanted to play baseball. That's all he wanted to do. He didn't want to talk to the sports writers. He didn't care that they had a deadline or needed to sell papers, for that matter. You know.
But that, you know, people say that, but they do have a contractual responsibility to talk to the media after the games, and some of them honor it, and a lot of them don't. But you know, I think Dick did talk to the media on many occasions. I felt like he probably felt like he got burned, and so he probably was reluctant to talk to some of them, and didn't. And you know, he was an enigmatic figure. I mean, I don't think sports writers ever really knew how to deal with him or how to handle him. Not handle him, but how to relate to him. Right. You know, he was. I've had. There are players like that come along, and he was certainly one.
Yeah, and you know, how have things changed? You know, I was talking earlier that there are not a lot of videos of Dick Allen to watch on YouTube or see some of these mammoth home runs that are so legendary at Connie Mack Stadium. You know, Mitch, what do you think if Dick played nowadays and there was more media, social media, would he be more accepted by fans? Would his side of the story have been told? His Frank Thomas story have come out? Would he post something on Instagram about what really happened?
Well, he wouldn't have.
No.
It's just so different. I mean, you know, now there's the Players Tribune, right? So, you know, players sometimes can post on there. They can get their stories out. Although I don't think he would do that. I think he's just a private guy. And I think that guys like that, they get talked about, and I guess they still feel today that they're misunderstood, and maybe he'd be picked apart more, right? I mean, you know, there's so much now. Like, at least back then, you know, there wasn't ESPN, and they weren't basically going through every one of your at-bats and looking at your launch angle, and you're looking at this, and you're looking at that. You had a little bit of privacy. I mean, he may not have thought he had privacy, but I think compared to today, he probably had a lot more. I mean, so would it be better? I don't think it would be better. What do you think? You think it would be better?
No, well, you know, you look at guys like Albert Bell, people that have similar psychological makeup now, and it didn't really work out too well for him. But let's just say it would be a lot harder for Alan to avoid all the media obligations that a player has today than it was when he played.
So, assuming Dick Allen was on SportsCenter more often, a lot of his top 10 home runs, he might have been covered more. You know, I think a lot of those stats, the launch angle, the exit velocity, he would probably stand up to some of the best hitters of all time. You know, and that kind of leads into the, you know, elephant in the room, Dick Allen's Hall of Fame induction, or certainly the lack thereof. You know, he had this contentious relationship with the media, who at the time voted for the players to enter the Hall of Fame. You know, he never got more than 18.9% of the vote from the sports writers. This was over 15 years on the ballot. You know, now he is on the Golden Days ballot, which won't vote again until the year 2020. So there's some time to wait before we hear again about what Dick Allen's fate may hold. The last vote on the Veterans Committee, he got 11 out of the 12 votes needed. So very close, one vote away. A lot of people anticipate, thanks to the hard work of Mark and Rich, that this might be Dick's turn. You know, a lot of the numbers, especially when you look at sabermetric numbers that are more popular now, still hold up. Dick Allen's home runs, his slugging, as he mentioned in the book, wants to be remembered as a complete ball player, someone who could steal bases and field and hit to both sides of the field, but certainly his numbers hold up. What do you guys think about his Hall of Fame credentials? Mitch, you want to start us off? I know you've done plenty of research.
Well, I mean, I think he's one of the few guys, old-timers, I guess you'd call him now, right? I guess he's one of the few old-timers who they look better. He was one of the few old-timers who look better with the newer statistics. Most of these guys, they don't look as good. He looks better. So, you know, I think that as years go by, interestingly, whereas most of these older guys fade, his case gets better. And so I just think it's going to keep getting better because there's just more and more of these advanced statistics that are going to show that when he played in a pitcher's era, his numbers were out of this world. So his baseball card statistics don't jump out at you, but when you put it in the context of the stadium he played in and the era in which he played, his numbers look really good. And then the other stuff, you know, the media stuff, I think that fades a little bit. I don't think it's that big of a deal anymore. I think it was a huge deal when sports writers were voting for him, but, you know, I think Barry Bonds has 53% in the last one. So Barry Bonds is getting 53% from the sports writers today. I don't think it's that big of a deal, but, you know. people have their own opinions, but I don't know, I just think his case keeps getting better as the year goes on.
Yeah, I think he's a lock. I mean, as close as he got in the last election, the more people realize how these modern statistics put him in a light with the best hitters of not only his era, but of eras before and since, that he's guaranteed to get in. That's just my view. But one thing about the exposure that he doesn't have, about how you can't see his home runs and how you can't measure them. They kind of live on for now, speaking as a fan now, for people my age who actually saw them or heard them on the radio or saw them on television or were there in person. They live on in your imagination and your memory, and they become bigger and larger than they really were. And they were, believe me, they were big and large. I've still never seen balls hit as hard or as far as he did. And I think that, in terms of him being a legend, being someone who people of my generation tend to, I don't want to say worship, but certainly mythologize, I think that aspect contributes to it. The fact that I went on YouTube today and looked for it, and you can hardly find, I think I saw maybe 2 home runs that he hit, and even they were grainy, black and white. You really
don't do them justice.
You really don't do them justice when you knew the dimensions of that ballpark. I worked at Cunningham Stadium one summer, the summer, in fact, that he hit 40 home runs, and every time he came to bat, I was selling sodas. I would take one of my sodas and find a seat up in the stands and just sit and watch, because that's how compelling a presence he was in his prime. There's never been anyone in Philadelphia baseball in my lifetime that was as compelling to watch as Dick Allen.
And I have a guy who emails me every so often to tell me that he hit a home run that went over the particular day, and over the scoreboard, did this, did that, whatever. And of course, there's no video and there's no whatever. But now you can't confirm that or whatever. But who cares, right? I mean, it's I know it went a long way, and like you said, I think it's better sometimes that you don't have every one of these. You can just pull up the video for it, because that's what makes him sort of a kind of a mythological figure a little bit, right? I mean, and so this guy who contacts me it's a very passionate thing for him, and it's great. I mean, we can have this argument forever, whereas you can't have that argument, not even an argument, discussion of where the ball went. But when you know it, you're not going to have it, right? And so, okay, hit the ball here, and then the story's over. This is so much better.
Right. It's like Babe Ruth's called shot.
And you call him a mythological figure, and that's an apt description, because there was something mythological, almost godlike about him when he appeared on the scene here in Philadelphia. I mean, he was this guy from this strange planet called Wampum, and he had these supernatural powers. I mean, he could hit a ball like no one, and he had this weapon that he used, this 38-inch, 40 or 42-ounce, some people will say, bat. I mean, to put that in comparison, Ryan Howard, who was a big, strong man, would swing a 34-inch, 32-ounce bat. Now here's a guy swinging a 38-inch, 40-ounce bat. I mean, you talk to modern players about that, they can't believe it. It's just like astounding to them. And he was, and like a mythological figure, he was in a way indecipherable. I don't think there were many people that understood Dick Allen, at least understood him well. As we said earlier, he was a complex man, and his legacy is just as complex.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I thought was really great about this book was Tim Whitaker trying to figure out, as he's writing the book, how to make sense of it, which I thought was really good. And I just, the funny thing is, I read this book many years ago, and then I referred to it when I wrote my book. And I picked it up for this, and I read it through again for the first time in several years, and it reminded me how much fun it is to read. I mean, it is such a fun book to read. And I thought that the one thing that as I said, that Whitaker was really struggling with is, well, how do you make sense of this guy who, we tend to think linear, and he mentions this. We tend to think on a linear basis, like first this, then this, then this. But Allen didn't think like that, and he didn't talk like that, and it didn't act like that. And it's hard to put someone in a box, when that's not what your expectations were. And it's just, you can never fully you can never fully figure him out, because his reality is just different. I don't know what else to say. I mean, our reality, my reality is this, then this, then this, but his wasn't. And he would tell different stories to different writers in the span of 20 minutes, you know? And, I mean, to me, it sort of reminded me of, you know, you go to the art museum, and there's a wall. If you go on the floor with the Impressionists, right? There's a wall of, there are these poplars that Monet did, right? And they're all the same poplars, right? But he paints them at different times of the day, different times of the year, and they look completely different, but they're the same trees. And to me, that was like Dick Allen, right? I mean, he's describing this thing, but his reality is changing as the light changes, and it becomes something different every time. And, you know, people hated the Impressionists too, right? So, because they didn't understand where he was coming from, and you couldn't really explain it in a sentence. And so I think, that's what I think of when you know, most people think of I think of Dick Allen when I see those poplars at the art museum.
Yeah, let's talk more about Dick Allen, the person. Frank, you mentioned he's from Wapham, Pennsylvania, which is the other side of the Commonwealth here, just a stone's throw from the Ohio border. It's a small mill town, 700 people in the last census. And there were two passages in the book, in the chapter on his hometown, that I wanted to just quickly read. Both of them took place in a bar, as a lot of baseball stories do. From page 41, half a dozen shot and beer locals sit at the bar. "Hey, Sleepy," the greetings come from around the bar. "A couple of Rolling Rocks," says Alan quietly. When the bartender goes to get the beer, Alan confides that his favorite beer is really Heineken, but that Wapham is an American beer town. "I drink the American beer out of respect for the people who work in the mill," he tells me in a near whisper, "but the stuff kills me." He also Tim Whitaker was talking to Ken Johnson, Dick Allen's cousin, and Ken said, "It's not easy being Dickie Allen and coming home to Wapham." After checking to make sure Dick's out of hearing range, Ken goes on to say, "Everybody wants a piece. When he was making a big paycheck, it was hard for him to know how to act, and it's still that way. He comes in here and buys everybody drinks, and he's a big shot. If he doesn't, he's cheap. Now, how does he handle it? I buy, and then at the end of the night, he takes me aside and hands me $40. He buys the whole house all night, but nobody knows." Right? That's kind of Dick Allen, I thought, in a nutshell. You know, you have these stories of him being boorish and confrontational and standoffish, but at the same time, respectful, certainly when it comes to his hometown, certainly when it comes to his mother, even his wife, ex-wife, Barbara. What do these stories tell you about Dick? He's a social guy, certainly, but not that social, right?
Yeah, but you know, that they probably tell you he has a drinking problem, for one thing. I mean,
He talks about that, yeah.
He admits in the book, if you read it, that he, you know, would drink before games, that he would oftentimes would hide stuff in the, you know, the paper towel rack in the men's room in the Connie Mack Stadium locker, and drink a couple beers during the game. That's the thing. That's one of the things that stands out. I mean, that's one Dick Allen. That's this guy that you know, that liked to defy expectations and rules, and you know, drink before a game and drink during a game. I mean, all baseball players drink after the game, believe me. But I never encountered many that drank before, and certainly not during the game. But I'm sure it's happened. But yeah, that's just one Dick Allen, and I think that's another side of him as well. And if you read the book, Tim Whitaker talks about it, that some days he can't drag anything out of them, and other days he's expansive, and you know, he wants to talk forever, and he's insightful and eloquent. And there are times when, you know, when he doesn't want to talk, and that's just the way he is. Nobody's going to put him in a corral.
Yeah, you know that story about buying the house. I spoke to a friend of his who went to high school with him, who said that in 2010, he did the same thing. There was his high school's 50th anniversary, and he paid for everybody's ticket for the golden anniversary. Nobody knew that he had done it, and then he didn't show up. Right, so he,
Classic dig
um,
right?
and so, he'll do stuff like that. So, then, and then there's the other side where he'll drink and be difficult. I just think a lot of people have many sides, and I just think he wasn't afraid to show you all the sides. I mean, I think he was what he was.
And he was one of those people that when you thought you had a handle on him, he would, almost as if he were saying to you, "You're never going to understand me," he would just go and do something completely different, just completely unexpected. I think to some extent, Wilt Chamberlain was like that, and that sometimes there are athletes that come along that don't fit easily in the boxes, and there's probably never been a better example in Philadelphia of that than Dick Allen.
Yeah, I think he seems to me like he's one of these guys who could handle the bad times better than the good times. If things were bad, he could focus and put it together, but when things were going too well, I think that's when the trouble started. And I think that you saw that in Chicago, and even after his career, when there were, things went well for a time, and then he would kind of just implode a little bit, but then he'd come back. And so, and I also got that feeling reading the book, that, I think at one point, Tim Whitaker mentions how we can't get him to talk about his MVP year in '72. Because there's nothing for him to say, right? I mean, that was the year where everything went well. But he'll talk a lot about Philadelphia, and he'll talk about Oakland, and he'll talk about things that went wrong in LA or St. Louis. But, with the good times, I think he has a problem with, or he had a problem. But it's, maybe he can't believe that things are going so well.
Right. And he certainly didn't care as long as he wanted to do things his way. And throughout his career, the book gives plenty of examples. Dick left a lot of money on the table, whether it was his fines, suspensions. He held out during spring training a few times. Even his early retirement cost him a few $100,000. He
Could I say one thing about
Yeah,
the fines, about the Phillies never understood how he looked at those fines.
Mhm.
They never got it. And Mark in particular, but also Skinner, and Quinn, right, basically the one doing the fines. They thought that a fine was a way to get somebody in line, because it worked with everybody else. He looked at the fine as the price for doing what he wanted. So he would actually say in advance, "What's it going to cost me if I don't go?" And they say, "That's going to be $500." You go, "Fine, it's $500 for a day off." So they never got it. I mean, particularly Mark didn't get it. And he would fine him and fine him and fine him. And when he would continually negotiate really good contracts for himself. I mean, he had an agent. He was one of the first players, I couldn't confirm this, but he may be the first player who actually had an agent negotiate a contract for him that wasn't related to him. I don't know if that's true, but, and he was always doubling his salary. And every time you doubled his salary, he looked at it like, I got more money to do what I want. And so, he would just say, just give me, put the envelope in the, in the slot, just don't give me a lecture. And, the Phillies never got that.
He was, well, I think Willie Stargell described him. He said he came along in this conservative era of great conformity, and he didn't fit in. He didn't want to fit in. And as a result, the sports writers, who I think are justly characterizing here as mostly reactionary, wanted to keep him in that box. Wanted to keep him in a box, and they couldn't accept the fact that it was, it was the same. If you look at his career, it parallels Muhammad Ali's to an extent, and especially, when Ali wanted to be called Ali and not Clay, the sports writers were among the last to accept that. They kept calling him Clay, writing him Clay. they just would not accept this athlete that wanted to be different. And it's the same case with Alan when he wanted to be called Dick and not Richie. They never called him Dick. I mean, eventually they called him Rich, but they never called him Dick. You know, it was just they wouldn't accept his nonconformity, and it was, in a way, it was you know, kind of the start of the 1960s rebellion.
Sure.
With,
He ends the book on that note. Tim's quoting Dick Allen by saying, "Baseball quit on me. I didn't quit on baseball." You know, do you think that follows along the same vein? Dick Allen was always Dick Allen, and the times changed, or what do you think he meant by that?
I found that a little puzzling because he did quit on baseball. I mean, it was in the middle of 1970. What was it?
74.
74
Right.
season. He just said, "That's it. I'm hanging it up." And he did it with the White Sox as well. I mean, when he, right, yeah, 74.
74.
Yeah, he walked away. So I found that a little confusing, but I know what he means. I mean, he felt like he was abandoned by baseball. And he probably was to an extent.
Yeah, I think he always felt that he was being sold a story that he knew from the beginning wasn't true. And so he would always say, in fact, when he was young, he would say, you're not gonna want me when I get older. I know you're not gonna want me. And so, because, you know, the way that they would negotiate contracts was, you know, you get underpaid on the way up, you get overpaid on the way down, and he was saying, you're not overpaying me on the way down. The second I can't hit, I'm gone. I know I'm gone. And he was right. And so I guess maybe he means that. I don't know. And he could mean that like, you know, the second I couldn't hit the way I could hit, I'm done, you know. Of course, it didn't help that he was in Oakland, which was just a mess of a franchise back then. I mean, it was chaos.
Still is.
Yeah, but I mean, that was, yeah, you had MC Hammer, you know, kind of running the team, and Charlie Finley, who just, you know, it was a nightmare. But, you know, he was in, it was funny, I always thought it ironic at the very end, he was put in the hands of the only person who might be more of an outcast than he was, right? I mean, Charlie Finley. Yeah. I mean, it was the two outlaws and outcasts together, because nobody else would have them. Charlie Finley couldn't sign any players, because free agency came, and they all wanted to get the hell out of Oakland. And everybody's trying to get out, and Allen wants to go to Oakland, I think under the theory of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? But didn't work out.
But yeah, no, I mean, I think that ending kind of sums up the book as a whole. It's certainly a one-sided perspective on Dick's retirement. It is, of course, an autobiography, so you know, we're meant to sympathize with Dick Allen, with Tim's storytelling. You know, pretty much a lot of the occasions, like in Little Rock, his start with the Phillies, the Frank Thomas incident, the incident when he put his hand through the headlight, and then just kind of with the sports writers in general. You know, how much do you guys think the book is an honest account of what happened versus, you know, more of Dick's kind of storytelling for story purposes?
Well, you know, I think as Mitch alluded to, I think Tim Whitaker spent the whole book trying to get a handle on Dick. And it's an unusual book in that there are portions that Dick Allen speaks in the first-person voice, and then there are other chapters where Tim Whitaker writes traditionally about it. But I found the portions where Allen speaks about himself, I find autobiography to be the least informative and true, you know, form of literature.
There are no citations.
No, there are no citations. Everybody has a human tendency to slant the perspective in their favor, and certainly Allen does in this book. And you know, some of the things are just silly. When he talks about Larry Bowa yelling at him because he didn't pick enough balls out of the dirt, and he said, "No, I told Bowa, you got to learn how to throw." You know, I mean, Bowa had a great arm, and I'm sure he made a couple bad throws, but there are incidents like that throughout the book. I think it sort of diminishes it. And as I say, it's a natural human tendency to want to make excuses for things that didn't go well, but it's also one of the flaws of autobiography. So I found those portions of the book a little less interesting than the traditional portions that Tim wrote.
Yeah, I thought the one thing I wish was that if Tim pushed back a little more, right? So, because, yeah, when Alan starts to talk and start to like justify all these things, I mean, some of them just aren't true. I mean, like 1970, he talked about St. Louis, and why did he sign the contract in St. Louis? Well, you know, I didn't want to be blamed for ruining free agency. Well, that was all before all that, right? I mean, that wasn't why he signed. I mean, he signed because he was a guy without a lot of leverage at that point. And Bush promised him certain things, and that's why he signed. I mean, he didn't sign because Kurt Flood hadn't filed his lawsuit. I mean,
Right.
he was just a guy who was holding out, and he was in the middle of an argument with the Phillies at that point. So you know, you could. I guess the one thing would be that if Tim would push back a little, you know, in that process, and you know, maybe that's not so true. Let me show you this, and now what do you think? As opposed to just letting him go.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I would agree with that. That I think that's I think it's a lot of it. There is a lot of
Self-serving, but
yeah.
understandably.
It's rose-colored glasses, but I also think that the bigger truth comes out. I mean, so I think the ultimate truth is real, you know, even though there are parts here and there which I can pick apart, and anybody can pick, that didn't happen, that's okay. But like you said, anybody can do that. But I think the ultimate truth was a good point. I think he's right about the big things. He might be wrong about the little things, but I think he's right about the big things. So.
Yeah, I mean, Tim Whitaker certainly doesn't make any bones about it. The first words of the epilogue are, "I love Dick Allen, how's that for straight down the middle?" Right, that was his quote. He clearly enjoyed his time traveling around the country with Dick and going to bars and hotels and just hearing baseball stories at more bars. So in that sense, it's not wholly an autobiography, right? You know, obviously he had a lot of help, and Tim put it together. How do you think that works for telling the Dick Allen story? You know, would it not have been told otherwise if Tim didn't hound him?
Well, I mean,
he had Dick had plenty of opportunity to tell his side.
and he said,
This
you know,
came
and
10
Mitch
years
said
later.
when Mitch was doing his book, he couldn't get out to cooperate with him, so he's never really been revealing. And so these aspects of the book where he attempts to reveal his story himself could have really been compelling reading, but they, as I said, they end up, I think, being self-serving, and it leaves you scratching your head and saying, boy, this could have been a great book, and it's still a very good book. It's an enjoyable read. It's an easy read.
Very easy read.
But yeah, I think it could have been a lot better.
You know, if a Dick Allen book, if you don't walk away from a Dick Allen book scratching your head, that's probably not a real Dick Allen book, right? But yeah, I mean, there's a backstory to how those two got together in terms of money and things like that. You don't need to get into, but it wasn't like you know they got together and wrote a book. There was a time in his life where, you know, a few bucks was helpful, and so Whitaker was a guy that he trusted, and so that's how the book ends up being made. No, there was a guy who tried to work with him earlier on a book, and that didn't work out, and he can be tough to deal with, you know, and he's defensive. You know, not without cause, you know, but I think some of that comes through in the book, and you see that as it comes through, that he's defensive, and like, you know, you can't read it and first not notice it, but you also can't read it and not understand why he might be defensive. So, you know, maybe that comes through unintentionally.
One thing I'll say in the Phillies' defense, for as guilty as they were in a lot of the stuff that happened to Dick, and he rightly points out in the book, they've kept him employed now for a couple of decades in a job that I don't know what he does. I mean, he's got some type of community relations, public relations job, but it's not too trying. You know, I don't think he's got a lot of responsibilities, and the Phillies, to their credit, have kept him on the payroll all these years.
Yeah, and the thing with those events, like there was one, was it when did Tommy go up on the wall? Was it last year?
2 years ago.
Or 2 years ago? Yeah, 2 years ago. There, I spoke to somebody at the Phillies who were like, he's supposed to be here.
That's
And,
always,
and,
he'll be here.
right, and it was, you know, it's always a moment, like, is he gonna be here, is he not gonna be here? That's half the fun, right? Is
It
to
is.
show
That's
up
the
for this.
legend, that's the myth.
Right,
That's-
and, yeah,
It
so.
wouldn't be Dick Allen without all of that.
Right, he didn't show up for that thing, but you know, look, that's the thing, right? That's what makes him more interesting than Jim Rice. That's it, you know? If he showed up for everything and answered all your
And
questions,
we're a model citizen, yeah, he wouldn't be nearly as interesting.
yeah, you wouldn't care. So, you'd have to take it all.
Yep, but certainly plenty of people care, you know, his legacy, his numbers, like fine wine have gotten better with age. We have some questions, we're gonna open it up to the audience. Had one quick question from Facebook. Gene wanted to know, what do you think Dick Allen's favorite city to play in? Obviously, here in Philadelphia, he had a lot of issues when he first started, but he came back for his second stint once the vet was built. He settled down in Bucks County on a beautiful horse farm after he retired. But he says very specifically in the book, when he was playing, Chicago was his favorite home team to play for. Where do you guys think, from what you know about him, where's his favorite place to play? I guess other than Wappam.
Yeah, I was gonna say, Pittsburgh probably, because he could get home, and
Yeah.
probably could, you know, buy some Rolling Rocks for the boys in Wampum. And he said he liked LA, he liked the weather. He still has a place out there, I think,
Yeah.
doesn't he? He's still, you know, so I think he probably, you know, finds California appealing. He talked about not liking Atlanta at all. I know that, and I don't think New York was his cup of tea either. But everybody likes Chicago. I mean, they used to play day baseball all the time, so players could go out all night. You know, that's why players like Chicago.
Would you rate?
Yeah, I would say what you said pretty much, that, you know, first of all, his favorite place to play would be in his backyard,
Right.
right?
Hidden stuff.
If you,
Big
right,
stuff.
yeah, and if you could, as he said, you know, if you could lock the gates and let nobody in, that's the perfect place. But I think Chicago, he likes Chicago. But look, he had issues in Chicago. And, you know, I think things went well, and it was difficult. I think the thing that he had a problem with in Chicago ultimately was, I think that he felt like, I feel like he's the kind of guy who has an overwhelming need to control the narrative. And when the narrative is taken away from him, he gets upset. And so there was going through all this when I was doing it, I got through a lot of the Chicago papers, and as you know, the years went on, in 72, 73, and 74, by the time you get to 74, Chuck Tanner is getting a lot of credit for handling and knowing how to deal with Allen, and he really did not like that. And he, in fact, he even said, you know, look, I put on my pants every day for the Phillies when I had to play for Mark and Quinn, and I do it here in Chicago. And yeah, I like Chuck, but that's not why I'm playing better here. You know? And so, you know, I think that he really bristled. You know, he was done in Chicago. Well, obviously quit, right?
Mhm.
So he was done in Chicago. Although after he quit, he wanted to go back, and there were waiver rules that wouldn't let him come back at that point. But and then I think Roland Heeman and even Chuck Tanner at that point just felt like they had to move on.
Yeah. His shelf life was usually short.
Do you think that hurt his Hall of Fame credentials, longevity, or anything like that? You know, he had a solid.
Yeah, I mean, it
stretch.
truncated his career. People, the first thing people say about Dick Allen is what could Dick Allen have been if he had been a normal baseball player? You wonder. But there are players in the Hall of Fame with less longevity than him. You know, guys like DiMaggio and don't have Koufax. So I don't think that's necessarily a liability. When you're borderline like he is, it probably is. But as I say, I think he's going to get in. I wouldn't be surprised if it were 2020. With guys like Froggy toot his horn, you know.
Yeah, so believe it.
Yeah, I think that like a lot of these guys, when they move around a lot, they don't have a connection to one place, but he does. He really does. He has a really strong connection here, and in Chicago.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I don't, I just think for a guy who didn't like to talk a lot, he really has a really strong connection in both of those places, so I don't think that hurt him. I think what you said is right. I think he doesn't, the thing that hurt him while he was playing outside of for the Hall of Fame was that he didn't have enough average years, right? He didn't have those other years. He had 11 just fantastic years, but then he didn't have the other 3 or 4 on both sides of it, where he's just, he's a good player, but not a great player, so he didn't build those numbers up. I think, look, some of that was because he was just injured a lot, and so, he took off like a rocket, then he got hurt, and for most of his career, he was battling some injury or another, and, so I think
People look at the numbers and they don't realize the era he played in when pitching was so dominant that they had to, lower the mound, and so, yeah, if you look in context, I think he makes his case even stronger.
Okay, we want to open it up to the audience for some questions. In the back, Vinny?
Yeah, I had a question. When you talk about the racism and integration going on in baseball back then, what did the media look like back then? Were they as integrated, or were they?
In most of the larger cities, there were African-American newspapers, so you had African-American reporters from those places, but most didn't send their reporters on the road with the team. So yeah, they were, even when I was doing the Phillies in the early 90s and mid-90s, it was still virtually all white, all male. And it's not a heck of a lot different today, I want to tell you, in baseball. There are some places where it's better than others, but here it's still pretty much an all-white enterprise, all-male enterprise.
Question?
I was wondering, one of the interesting parts I thought of the book was the whole Chuck Tanner part. And I was wondering if, it seemed like the way they described how Chuck handled the players then was more like how managers handle the players today, where they're not the Gene Mauch type, the field general who's browbeating the players. I was wondering if you think Dick would have done better under that today's type of managing. I realize there would be differences, like they probably wouldn't let him use the 42-ounce bat nowadays. He'd probably be using 34-ounce bat or that type of thing. But I was wondering if you thought that he would do better
What do you think?
than today's managers.
Well, he did better for Tanner for a couple of years, right? I always think Tanner is like the forerunner of Madden, right? Today. I mean, he's kind of like the ultimate player's manager. So, yeah, I think he would, I think he does well. He did well better when things were difficult and tough. And when things were going well, he didn't do as well. So, even if you gave him all that space, right, I think eventually he'd create something to put himself in a position where he could react a little more comfortably like he was used to, I think. So, yeah, like I said, Tanner continued to manage after that, but that was, he had his 3 years there, and that was it.
Well, that was the other thing in the book, that they talked to Willie Stargell when Tanner was managing in Atlanta, and Willie Stargell said that the players didn't like playing for Chuck Tanner, so it kind of contradicted the whole idea of him being the players manager.
Yeah, I think they thought in Atlanta, they thought he was a little rah-rah. A lot of guys don't respond well to that pat on the back, go get them type manager. I think some players are just more cerebral than others and more laid back, and they don't react well to that. But I think Allen and that Chicago team did, that because maybe, as you point out, that it was a relatively new thing in baseball. Baseball managers tended to be either like Walt Austin, who were dead almost, or like Mauch, who were little martinets. They wanted to run every aspect of the game from infield practice through the 9th inning.
from looking him up and reading about him and reading the book, do you think he would be more appreciated today if he played than he was back then? Because I feel like him playing back then, he kind of gets swept under the rug because he had personality issues, or there's not much video of him. Do you think he would be more appreciated as more of a player today?
Well, I mean, I think, as I said earlier, I think the fact that he was sort of under the radar added to the myth. Now, whether it added to his value as a player, I don't know, but it's certainly in my mind, looking back at him from the perspective of 40, 50 years now, makes him a much more fascinating character than anybody I can think of today, where they're overexposed, let's face it. I mean, you know, you can't fly under the radar today. There's too much radar. So yeah, I think, again, from my perspective, I love the fact that there's little out there but imagination to recall Dick Allen's greatest hits.
I could never see Dick Allen, you know, they have now the post-game press conference and all the players coming out on that thing.
Oh, yeah.
I could never see him doing that, right? I mean, he was more of a guy who would, you'd sit by his locker and he would come by and he'd ask you if you wanted a taste of the J&B he had up there. And you'd have a conversation, right? But it wouldn't be this where you come and you sit down and, you know, like the Phillies do it, and most teams do it now, right? So, you know, I think that would be tough for him.
Yeah, he would have rebelled. He would have not shown up at
Right.
some pre-World Series news conference and
Right.
everybody. He would have become an issue. Much as, if you remember, Iverson didn't at his Hall of Fame induction weekend. He didn't show up for the first news conference. So, yeah. Marshawn Lynch. Yeah.
Now, what about his teammates? You know, would his teammates be okay with him not showing up for these sorts of things? A lot of times, the book talks about how the managers had one set of rules for Dick Allen and one set of rules for the 24 other players on the team. Did he get along with his teammates? Were they?
You know, I didn't cover him, but everything I read in the books, you know, it seems to be that his teammates loved him, that he played hard, that he wanted to win, that he played the game right between the lines, and that's, you know, that's what players care about. They don't, you know, all this other stuff that the media focuses on and that fans focus on, it doesn't really mean a heck of a lot to athletes, professional athletes. They're more, all they really concerned about is what goes on inside the lines. And I think from that standpoint, I think Allen was highly regarded by his teammates. Certainly, if this book is any indication, and Mitch's book.
Yeah, I mean, I spoke to Larry Christensen about it. I asked him that question, and he laughed about all of that. He said, you know, like what you said. He said, all we care about is when the game is on, is this guy going to be there, and can I count on him? And he would say, can I count on this guy to back me up? And what he does before the game and after the game, I really don't care. And most of those guys were like that. You know, if you showed up and you were, you know, when the game was on, you were the man. That was it. You know, some of these, he said to me, like, you know, some there were cliques. Some guys would go out and do certain things, and other guys would do their own thing. You know, whatever. You know, here and there, maybe a guy grumbled, but it didn't. You know, it didn't really matter. I think a lot of fans, you know, like as a fan, right? We all played some sort of sport when we were kids. You know, Little League baseball or soccer or whatever we played. We had this idea of like teamwork and this and rah-rah. And it was professional athletes are completely different. It's a whole different thing.
You know, it is.
And we
They're
look,
not fans.
Yeah.
They don't
That's
pay
a big
this.
part of the book. Yeah, Dick Allen doesn't like to watch baseball
Yeah,
games.
that's
Baseball
typical.
game's boring. He likes to play. He'll play any baseball game you have, but it's boring.
yeah, we look at it, I think, in terms of, would I want this guy on my 12 to 13-year-old soccer team? Well, that's not what they're doing.
No.
Nothing.
Well, Fletcher Cox said that he'd never seen a Super Bowl. He never watched one until he played in one. You know, that's not unusual.
Yeah, but that's the point. That is the point. I mean, we're talking to an audience here that half of them don't even know Dick Allen. So I'm trying to sit here and think, like, I remember him playing, and I'm trying to think of who today could be Dick Allen. you know, I'm listening and you're saying, you know, if you talk to another baseball player, you know, a teammate or a colleague, all they care about is, what are you going to do between the lines?
Mhm.
That's relevant today, no matter what sport you pick, at any level. Are you going to show up between the lines? And this man did that. So, I mean, I think we're given a perspective, and I mean, we've read it in the book, but I don't know if our students realize this man was extremely good, extremely good. And I can only think that if he was playing today, Sports Center would go, you know, all out
Yeah,
for this
but they'd
man.
also go all out on his revelations about drinking before a game or
There's no doubt
whatever, you know,
about
so,
that.
yeah.
But who created Dick Allen? Did Dick Allen create Dick Allen, or did the
No.
society, when he came up, play a major part in creating Dick Allen?
Well, he always would say, because going back to the point you made and your point, which was there's different sets of rules, right? He always said there was two sets of rules before I got into baseball, right? There was a set of rules for the white players and a set of rules for the black
But
players.
that was in society,
Well,
too.
but that's what he's talking about.
Right,
He
exactly.
said, so when he says, I want to be treated differently, you know, and then fans or the sports writers at the time would say, well, that's wrong, look at this guy, you know, he's a big shot, and his response is, no, I'm not a big shot, there were two sets of rules before I got here. All I want is to play by those rules, and I don't want them to relate to, well, white players get this treatment and black players get that treatment. Which I think a lot of fans and the writers at the time, it was a shock to the system. I mean, they never heard a guy say that. They may have thought it, but they sure as hell weren't going to say it.
Yeah, they thought, the white sports writers thought they knew how a black athlete ought to act. Allen didn't act that way. And, you know, he basically said, screw you to the white writers, and I'm gonna do what I wanna do, and, that wasn't easily swallowed in those days. You know, reporters would, and let's face it, sports writers were basically the only access you had to these guys back then. And they weren't willing to accept that, and, you know, they could paint him in a light that he wouldn't be painted in today. That's true.
Yeah, I think that you know, the Dick versus Richie thing was that plays into that also, because I think at that time there's a hierarchy, right? And the sports writers were higher up than most players other than the superstars,
Yeah.
but they were higher than all the black players. And then when he comes in, he's a 22-year-old rookie saying, my name is Dick. No way are you going to tell, you know, a sports writer for the Inquirer who's been there since 1948 what to call this guy, right? And I think they, you know, he got their backs up, you know, a little bit. And I think that's when that played out. So, yeah.
Question in the back.
Yeah.
Rich.
In the book, Alan mentions the fight with Frank Thomas, and you know that day that it happened, he was hitting .348, just got named to the All-Star team, and in a matter of half an hour, his whole career was basically changed, altered forever. And you got to think how poorly the Phillies handled that whole situation.
Oh, absolutely.
It was they botched it. I mean, John Quinn, Bob Carpenter, G-Mock, it was just totally handled the wrong way, and basically threatening Allen with a fine and muzzling him for years. Couldn't talk.
And by getting rid of Thomas, they maybe inadvertently scapegoated Allen. I mean, he was suddenly the villain of the piece, and then by muzzling him, he never got to tell his side of the story. So there was no way he was going to come out of that incident looking in. You know, that's why he was booed. I mean, people
And the
said.
players all knew.
Yeah, the players knew. I mean,
True.
Callison said what a jerk
Yeah.
Frank Thomas was, how he baited guys. You know, not just black guys, everybody. He was just a pain in the ass.
Richie Ashburn used to call him like Big Donkey.
Yeah,
He said
Big
the wrong
Donkey.
thing at the wrong time.
Said he wasn't the brightest guy on the
Yeah.
team by a long shot.
He didn't get the big donkey for his brains.
Yeah.
But you know, I'll stand up for the Phillies on that one, a little bit, in that I think they had good intentions. They screwed it up, but I do think that the context of that is that the summer before, right, Allen as a rookie had gotten into some hot water when a Sports Illustrated writer came by And he made a comment about he didn't care about the Rookie of the Year because there was no money in it, and then that blew up. And I really think that what they were trying to do when this happened was they tried to muzzle everybody because they didn't want it to blow up again. Now, of course, it ended up blowing up even bigger, right? So it was not handled well, but I do think that they were trying to avoid a repeat of what happened the summer before. And they didn't do it well, and they didn't do it right, and they released Frank Thomas, and that made it worse. And yeah, it spiraled out of control.
And is any good that came out of that is that Dick and Frank Thomas made their peace in '89 at the Old Timer game, the '64 reunion. They made their peace, and they're bonded ever since. So,
To an extent.
yeah, to this day.
Depends on when you talk.
Yeah.
Do you think that Dick Allen, had he played today, would have settled into a role like Malcolm Jenkins, where there's a little bit more activism to promote some of the causes he's involved with? It seems like in reading some of the elements about Dick and in the book that I don't know, it could be a coin toss.
Yeah, I think just when you think he would be settling into a role like that, he would confound you and step away from it, or do something else. I think that was more his nature than the activist, was the confounder.
Yeah, I don't think he didn't really have any sort of social, I mean, it's every human being has something, but I mean, in terms of like a Malcolm Jenkins, I don't see that. I mean, he was never able to see the relationship between him and Curt Flood. I mean, he lived the life that Curt Flood was arguing in the Supreme Court about. He lived it more than Curt Flood did. Curt Flood was treated, the Cardinals, relatively at least, treated their players a lot better than the Phillies did. And so everything he was saying, Curt Flood, or everything his briefs were talking about, Allen lived all that stuff. And in fact, Curt Flood took a lot of the words that Allen used and made them his own. But he never saw the connection between himself and Curt Flood. People tried to get him to see the connection. He never saw it. In fact, he would always say, look, that cat is trying to change baseball. All I want to do is get the hell out of Philly. And so, the Players Association tried. Marvin Miller thought he could be someone who would be, his story at least was something that would resonate, but he didn't.
Speaking of people who ought to be in the Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
Marvin Miller.
Dick Allen describes himself in the book as a ball of confusion he got from the Great Temptation song. But I think the book suffers, and I imagine that Allen suffered personally by what he never knew a lot of what was going on. The Phillies didn't know, sports writers didn't know. He didn't know, he didn't fully understand the situation he was dropped into in Little Rock and then in Philadelphia. And no one ever made an effort to find out. And that's kind of a gap that has never really been filled in.
Yeah, when you think about that too, here's a franchise that had struggled mightily, on the field, and here they get this once-in-a-lifetime talent, and they just mishandled him. I mean, they, as you said, they dropped him into Little Rock without any, education about what to expect. And the same thing here in Philadelphia, and then the Thomas incident, and what a way to handle a potentially invaluable asset.
I think the Phillies had a problem organizationally and specifically in the stands at Connie Mack that had been brewing for 20 years. And it blew up when fans were faced with the first black superstar for the Philadelphia Phillies. Bottle throwing has a long tradition in Philadelphia going back to the early 20th century. There are letters from Warren Giles at the time to the Carpenter saying, I hate to keep writing to you about all the bottle throwing, but it's a big problem at Connie Mack, and you've got to do something about it.
I was at a game there, Connie Mack, and it was Mike McCormick from the Giants was throwing a perfect game through 5 innings, and rains came and they stopped the game. And fans were furious, and they threw bottles on the field. and I'm not exaggerating, the circle around home plate was like obscured by bottles. I mean, it was a common thing there. It was,
I mean, it became a racial thing.
Right, it did.
After Jackie Robinson.
Yeah.
So it got worse.
it did.
Yeah, and as I said, I think that comes from the top. You know, if you get the cue from the top that it's okay and there's not going to be any retribution, then you get more and more people who otherwise would either not show up or would keep their mouths shut or their bottles holstered, start throwing things. And so, you know, as I look at this, you know, and I just see a failure at the top. That's where it was. You know, if there was somebody like a Branch Rickey who very quickly would say, no, this isn't going to happen, then not say nothing would happen, but wouldn't have been what happened.
But again, Dick doesn't see that, he has nice things to say about the Carpenter.
Well, because I think
Generally.
that he
It's like Rulli, yeah.
yeah, I mean, and I think that he, you know, he dealt regularly with John Quinn, who, by the way, was, you know, much more progressive racially than Bob Carpenter was. And, you know, wasn't a progressive, but he was on the scale, he was much further to the left than Bob Carpenter was. But I think Alan, he dealt with Quinn, and you know, Quinn had a way of dealing with players, which was, you know, here's our number. That's it, you know, maybe you can, you know, we'll let you one time, can give you a counter offer, but then that's the end of it. And then Alan brings in an agent, and so he didn't like Quinn because he had to deal with Quinn. And then Carpenter, you know, tried to placate him, but Carpenter, you know, he said Alan was confused, Carpenter was confused, right? Carpenter was the one who didn't know what to do. He's the one who screwed it all up. Yeah. Between the two of them. You're gonna be, which one was more confused?
Right.
Carpenter was more confused.
Another question right here?
Yeah, I grew up in the '70s, so the Dick Allen I knew already had the chip on his shoulder. And until I read the book, now I understand kind of where the chip came from. So I appreciate the book that way. I think to really get to the bottom of it, though, you almost have to know what happened in those first 18 years of his life, growing up in Wampum. You know, it sounds like, you know, like he wasn't allowed to talk to white girls who, you know, maybe he wanted to go out on a date with or whatever. I wonder how he dealt with kind of all that happening there, you know, because being a nonconformist like he is, how did he deal with those first 18 years? Was his mom able to keep him in that kind of in line and just get him through high school, or, you know, was he in trouble in high school? How did all that go down? I think that would maybe give us a pretty good picture of how Dick Allen developed.
Yeah, I don't, honestly, Mitch probably knows more about his first 18 years than I do, but I always got the impression that he's, you know, that his mother was his son, you know, I mean, his orb, that she, you know, what she said went, and she kept him in line. There was, his father, I guess, left pretty early, and it sounded like Dick always respected his dad. His dad was a guy that started a business and made success out of it, but that his mother was the great force in his life. And he had four older brothers too.
Yeah.
Yeah, and a couple of whom played in the major leagues as well. And so he had, you know, I think he had a relatively stable life there. Now, I can't speak to anything beyond that.
Yeah, I mean, I spoke to people he grew up with, and I think, look, you know, you grow up black today, you know, it's not easy. And then you know, go back a half century. But, you know, in terms of what it was like compared to other places, I think Wampum was pretty, you know, on the good side. It wasn't the South, and it wasn't, you know, it was a small town, and there was, Chewton was on one side, and Wampum was on the other, and Chewton was where usually where the black families lived, and Wampum was where the white families lived, and then they all went to the same school. And I think things were relatively calm and there wasn't any huge issues, but there are issues, as he pointed out in the book, there were issues. But, you know, I think really for him, you know, when you speak to people, it's funny, when you speak to people, when I spoke to people there, it depends on who you spoke to. When you spoke to white people, they talked about how, oh, it was like an oasis, right? Like, you know, oh, nobody saw color, this and that. But then you spoke to black people who were like, no, that was not true. It was better than other places. But like Alan says in the book, and people told me, there were places you couldn't go, there were things you couldn't do, and if you didn't understand that, you know, you'd be put back in line. So yeah, it was not an oasis, but I don't think it was not like growing up in, you know, in Alabama. So, and he really respected his brothers, his older brothers. I mean, he had one, Coy was a half-brother, and he really was like the father figure for him. And Coy played some professional basketball, and he was in the military, and he played some Negro League baseball. And Coy helped negotiate his first contract for him, and he was the one who kept him out of the South initially. He made the Phillies agree not to send him to south of the Mason-Dixon line, which they agreed to, and then 2 years later, they reneged on that. But I think he had a relatively, I mean, his father wasn't around, but it was a relatively stable upbringing, and he had good friends, and he played baseball and basketball, and he was an okay student, but not a great student.
He talked about in the book how some of the other black players in the National League, like Willie Mays and Aaron, would go up to him and ask him, what part of the old country are you from? Meaning the Deep South, which is where most of the, you know, the early African American players in Major League Baseball came from, and they were sort of, you know, amazed that this was a guy from the north and from a small town.
One last question.
So Alan hit pretty well down the stretch in '64 when things started to kind of collapse around him. Does anything change if they win the pennant, go on to win the World Series, or is he still kind of, did that affect him in any way? If you look at his numbers in September, it certainly, he certainly contributed in a very positive way, especially against the Cardinals. They played 7 times head to head. Did that ever weigh on him in a particular way?
I don't think he ever got to the World Series, did he? No, he never got to the World Series, so it would have looked better on his resume now going to the, you know, to the Hall of Fame, and I'm sure it would have, you know, it had to help him psychically, but I don't know what other effect it might have had on him. He was, as you say, you can't knock him for anything in that rookie season. That was a spectacular season. Really one of the great rookie seasons in history. I mean, it doesn't look that way with 29 home runs and, 99 RBIs or something, but you look at the runs scored and the hits, and the walks, yeah, it's just astounding.
Rookie of the Year candidate, easy.
Yeah, I mean, for all of the grief that he took throughout his career, nobody blamed him for 64. I mean, you know, everybody blamed Mark, but they didn't blame him.
Still blame Mark.
Yeah.
I think what he said, you know, is if he's in the World Series, I might put a different perspective on him as far as him being in the Hall of Fame, because
Oh, yeah.
a lot of, you know, you read, well, he never played the postseason, you know, other than, you know, that division championship. You know, a lot of people put emphasis on playing in the postseason, which I think is really, I think they're bonus stats. I don't think really they should be allowed when you're voting for the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, one thing
But
that's
unfortunately, they are. you
yeah,
know.
one thing that's amazing though, if you think about it, okay, they didn't make it in '64, not his fault, but in '72, they almost beat one of the greatest teams of all time.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
they came within 5 games of beating. You look at the lineup of the '72 White Sox and put that up against the '72 A's. There's no comparison.
Yeah.
And you know, they almost beat them.
Yeah.
And really, it's mostly because of him and Carlos May. I mean, that's really, and more him than Carlos May. I mean, talk about a guy who just put the whole team on his back. I mean, you know, Reggie Jackson and Sal Bando, Catfish Hunter, these guys almost beat him. I mean, to me, that's worth something. I don't know what it's worth, but that's something.
All right, well, I think we can end there. I wanted to thank our panelists, Frank, Mitch, Holy Family for hosting us, the audience for participating and listening. Our next book club event will be in the baseball season, which is now upon us, starting on Wednesday. So definitely check philliesnation.com for your news. Read Frank's column every Sunday. More from Mitch if you want to read more about Dick Allen. Obviously, Mitch's book is the next logical choice. So check holyfamily.edu as well for future events here on campus. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.